Franck Meijboom. He's Associate Professor of Ethics of Human-Animal Interactions, and he's studied in a number of different places, including the centre of the Netherlands and the far northeast of Scotland as well. He's affiliated to the Veterinary Medicine of Utrecht, the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine of University Utrecht, and the Ethics Institute of Utrecht University, as well as being head of the Centre for Sustainable Animal Stewardship and a member of the Adaptation Physiology Group at Wageningen University. So again, widespread expertise across a range of institutions there. Frank's going to be speaking on animals in perspective, on animals and transitions towards sustainability. It looks from his slides like he'll expand on a few of the themes that we've been thinking about already today, but from a slightly different perspective, particularly focusing in on the role of animals within not just the food chain, but their multifaceted values and aspects in society. Yep, perfect. Thank you, Frank. Take it away.
Okay, Richard, thank you very much for the introduction, also for inviting me to this this nice session. What I would like to do in the 25 minutes I have is to make more or less these 4 steps, which by definition are only touching upon certain items, of course, because they're quite ambitious. So I would like to show the increasing ethical issues if we look to the future of food and discussions of sustainability. I would like to claim that we lack a clear position of animals in the transitions we see towards sustainable food, but that when you take the animal in a more central position, it might help us to think out of the box and look a little bit different to many of the rather complex discussions we already discussed in discussion with Martin's presentation. And finally, the question is, to what extent could Christian tradition be helpful, especially because there is a bit of a double position from especially Christian ethics to animals and their status. So there are a lot of food-related transitions in our society linked to the protein transition, discussions on climate, circular agriculture, but also all kinds of discussions related to what we now call pandemic preparedness after the COVID epidemic, but even already before in discussions on what we call One Health. So the whole idea that human health cannot be seen without its links to environmental health or human health or animal health. So there are in the course of these transitions a serious increase of all kind of ethical questions about what is just, what is right, what's desirable. And I think the nice discussion we had before our short break is a nice example. Of course, it was not only ethical, but it shows the broad range of relevant questions that these transitions pops up. And just to show you in a few slides the dynamic context of the relation between agriculture and food and ethics, is that you can see that and as I said, there's a bit of a caricature, but especially after World War II, there has been a very strong focus on food security in our food policy, and as far as that, of course, has to do with values and has to do with ethics, and technology played a very important role in that to lead to a situation in which, at least in the Western world, most of us have access to sufficient food. So there you can say, well, ethics is mainly linked to ethics of technology. At the same time, already in the same line, you see that we started discussions about food safety. So it's not only about the amount of food, but also that we had certain standards about health and safety, leading to and I reckon the discussion we can have about the desirability of consuming and getting your products from supermarkets, but I still think this is a bit of a result of the transition, that we have those supermarkets with not just one type of dairy product, but many of them, and not one type of syrup, but many of them, and each of them at least have a minimal standard of food safety that, of course, some incidents apart are safe to consume. However, I said safety to a certain extent, of course, but from that, we had those discussions on, shouldn't we expand the discussion on safety to health in terms of public health? So this is just one aspect, the amount of sugar that are included in processed food, which added to the ethical debate. So it's not only about sufficient food so that we can survive. It's not only safe food that we do not get ill, so food-related direct health risk, but more on the long run that you see an increase of obesity or of diabetes. So that's a next step. A further step is, of course, to say, yes, that food security is highly important, but we see a growing population, and how should we deal with that? So one line is what we discussed before the break, and say, it's very nice to go to a local farmer, and already Marta showed at a personal level, say some logistical problems of driving. But this is another point of say, if we have to feed the world, we need this type of pictures with a great area of agricultural land, high technology, but at the same time, we then had the discussion starting on biodiversity, because it's nice to have those high-producing fields, but leading to the monoculture you see here on the right, whereas we have strong reasons to value biodiversity as well. Still, also there, all kind of ethical questions: is biodiversity an intrinsic value, so is it's important for its own sake, or do you say, it's for us as humans, or maybe if you see it in a wider context as part of the creation that's given to us? But it's another point that led to expanding the discussion. At the same time, and I think that was also nicely touched upon in our previous discussion, is that there is a lot of discussion up until, let's say, the years 1990, 2000 on availability, but not so much about the importance of culture, of tradition. So for instance, reasons of food safety on a European level, we have strict regulation on raw milk cheese, because especially in a large scale, there are all kinds of risks. So they are not really banned, but very restricted. And at the same time, so these are not only for aesthetical reasons, but for certain regions and for certain traditions, highly important to have. So that is another way where you see the dynamics and raising questions of weighing important values. And I would say it's not the next step, but more where you see that it will come all together is in that discussion of what is a sustainable way of feeding the world. It's set to 2050, but you could make it a little less ambitious in time, because we have the same problems, I think, already if we look to 2030, which is relatively close by. Even to make it more complex, and that's not, hopefully not to paralyze any discussion afterwards, but what you see is that this is embedded in a discussion on a very local level. So we just had some examples of home gardening, of close relationship with farmers, but even then many of these issues will pop up at the same time. To have, for instance, a supermarket where you have 5 to 10 types of the same product is possible because we have a huge global network that works quite effectively and brings all kind of products over the world all year around. So you have that local global issue, and at the same time the distinction between private and public. Private in the sense that on the level of, for instance, individual interactions between people, consumer and producer, but also with public. I mean here the fact that we need institutions, governments to help and to guarantee, because it's such complex issue to deal with it. Whereas what should be private and what should be public in this context is not by definition defined. So we, for instance, food safety definitely is something that we organize on a public level. But culture or the importance of biodiversity, where on that scale should it be? There are many thoughts. It is not my point that this is a kind of empty space where no one has thought about, but it's still, we lack a kind of consensus on many of these questions, where on the scale between private and public or local or global it should be discussed sometimes even, or at least should be regulated or decided. So then the next step is, if you, within that whole complex of ethical question, look at animals, something importantly happens. So they're there. You know, we produce animals for a number of reasons. Sometimes because they lay eggs or they give milk. In other ways because we like to eat meat. But the interesting thing is that there are a number of roles animals play in this transition or in these discussions about sustainable development. So they can be the cause, the multiplier of problems, or they can be seen as the victim. They can be seen as an inspiration or a solution. And the interesting thing is that there is not a single, or not a kind of univocal position for that animal. They can be just like the polar bear on the left, seen as a victim of all kind of production systems we have that have a huge impact on our climate. At the same time, we get inspired by how certain insects capture water, and how that could help us to still have kinds of agriculture in very dry areas. So in that sense, you see they play all these kind of roles, but it's complicated. And that is because the animal is not only have kind of different positions within all these kinds of transitions, but the animal itself, or at least the position of our animals in our society, is also in transition. And just to show you here the two sets of pictures as a kind of overview. So on the left, if you have a big sea animal that's stranded on the beach, and the picture here is from the 18th century, where it's seen as a nice resource of all kinds of oils and materials that we can use as humans. Where sorry, because the heading is in Dutch, but here it said the stranded whale has been rescued after 28 hours. So you see, within, let's say, 200 years, we moved from something that is on our beach and is seen as a resource to something that we use all of our resources to rescue. And you could question to what extent there's real progress, but it is at least something that you see the position of animals are changing. The other set is on the left, you see in black and white a dog that is used for transportation. I do not specifically know the UK legislation on this, but at least in the Netherlands, this is by law forbidden for reasons of animal welfare. And you could say the right picture is a little bit of the caricature of how we deal with dogs now. So the dog is no longer before the wagon, but and is in the car after behind the bike. And so here again, you could question whether this is a real improvement for the dog in terms of welfare. But it shows that in time and between the two pictures on the right, it's not even 200 years. It's about decades. So these movements go rather quickly. And the interesting thing is that we seriously lack a consensus in our societies on that position of animals. So you see groups who really urge for a strong position of animals, and that we should be much more restrictive in the way we use animals. At the same time, just of course a little bit playing with words and becoming a vegetarian a mistake. But you see that there are trends, of course. Yeah. So where maybe 30 years ago, people think talking about welfare in fish is something very, very strange. It's now even embedded in European legislation. So you see trends, but we do not yet have a fixed set of a position where we say, okay, well, this is what we can reasonably agree on if we talk about animals. So, and what you then see is there is no single role for animals in these transitions towards sustainability. There is not a clear consensus. And my claim is that at least as a result of that, at least implicitly, these animals are excluded from the debate, or they are reduced to one single issue. So they are seen as the problem. Or we have thought about certain ideas of solutions and say, oh, well, it's very nice because animals can very easily deal with waste products from our lifestyle. So they are either kind of a blind spot, so they have an important point, but we simply do not discuss them. So, for instance, if you look at the SDGs, the animals is quite difficult to recognize in these sustainable development goals, or they are seen as, well, the animal is a kind of health risk on 4 legs or 2 legs if you talk about birds, or we have certain ideas about circular agriculture, and luckily these animals can fill the gaps we still leave them. And I think that is problematic, both for the quality of our debate, but also for the animal. Sorry for that should be heuristic. It still was in Dutch. Why to take the animal seriously? Because I think if you look from the perspective of the animal, it may help to be a kind of out of the box position, to not only look from an anthropocentric situation, and sometimes open up to say, well, okay, if these animals that you can recognize in the first picture, if these cows are no longer there, what should we do with our land? So should we go to a solar landscape, or do we say, no, it's a kind of pastoral landscape for aesthetical reasons? We like that. It's also in terms of epistemic reasons. So it helps us, for instance, to understand what sustainability implies if you take welfare on board. So welfare is very much linked to individuals, and whereas many of the sustainability goals is about big groups, about collectives, and these can lead to all kind of tensions. So in that sense, it can help us to find conceptual gaps. And of course, a start in the perspective of animals shows also some problems we have in our society with our animals. So yes, we recognize them, but they're still not clearly embedded in our current institutions and debates. What you see is that we formulate or frame them quite often in a specific way. So as I said, as either the cause or the multiplier of the position, the problem of, or as a solution. And that quite often the attention to the animal welfare is the main focus of the discussion. So what you see is that, for instance, it leads to discussions: are current institutions capable of dealing with the challenges of sustainability? And that's, in this case, if you start with animals, to what extent are they really represented? Should they be? But this is not only the one-off in terms of animals, but I think it shows that, starting with animals, it shows that our institutions in many cases have difficulties dealing with the complexity of sustainability, because it really sometimes asks for a different way of organizing our society. Or if you say, yes, animal welfare is highly important, but is it enough? So if we deal with ethical questions of how we live together with animals as humans, is it enough, or are there new concepts necessary? So then my final few slides, and I have to be brief, but I thought, especially for this audience, to look a little bit to this final question, because these former slides are still on a very general level. And then you could say, from a Christian tradition, could we have something to add or bring something new in? And if you are from a very strict perspective, you say, well, there is not much in the Holy Scripture that really leads to a kind of nice outlook of a Christian animal ethics. So if you look at the New Testament, there are very few places where animals are really mentioned in a more normative way, and the use of animals is not problematized. But at the same time, just if you see here a few pictures, and you can come up with your own quite easily, animals play quite an important role in all kind of the Gospels, in how we portray important aspects of the Christian tradition. However, quite often also in discussions with, at least in my personal experience with non-Christians, a serious hurdle seems that for us from Genesis 1. So the whole idea that the whole situation problem actually starts here. We as humans have the dominion, and because of that, we are somewhere above animals and nature, and that has led to all kind of the serious issues we are now confronted with, and the reason that we have those enormously difficult discussions about sustainable development. And of course, there has been said a lot about that first from Genesis 1, but I think what is important is what is said there about the Radah, to rule, to have dominion, to dominate. Yes, we have, but it's, if you look at different parts in the scriptures, that same word is also mentioned by guiding, in terms of just as the shepherd here have dominion over his sheep and lead them. Yeah? So to take the lead, but it's not necessarily to suppress or overpower. So I think already here it's too easy to say, well, by definition, from a Christian tradition, it's a kind of domination in a very, well, let's say, aggressive or unfriendly way towards animals. At the same time, we are are discussing a tension between equality and a distinction. So on the one hand, humans and animals are part of the same creation. It's given by God, and they are created on the same day. So it's not something completely different. Here we share a lot. At the same time, there are fundamental differences. So we as humans are the only who are created after God's image. We are only, at least in terms of explicitly mentioned, created as male and female, and that clause from Genesis 1 to get that task, or I would say to do the freedom to dominate the world. At the same time, I would say the later tradition, for instance, by Thomas Aquinas, that very much make the distinction between the human world and the animal world, much more builds on the ancient Greek, on Aristotelian tradition, rather than, I would say, a biblical tradition. Although even, but that's far too much for this discussion here. But even, I would say, in Aristotle, the distinction between animals, humans, and nature is much more a continuum. As a final part, because otherwise I run out of time, I think it's nice, and I borrowed this example from Bernard Rowling, who passed away unfortunately earlier this year, who said, well, if you take this very famous psalm about the Lord who is my shepherd, he said, well, if you see this and you look to the picture on, I know this is already a bit of an outdated picture of poultry and in egg system, laying egg system, but this is about a shepherd. And if you say, well, suppose you say that the Lord is a kind of manager who put me in small cages so I can produce as much as possible. Then you say, well, that's not in line with Psalm 23. And Bernard Rowland said, well, this doesn't tell something about animal ethics, of course, but we would never say these things about our Lord. And apparently, the psalmist, the writer of the Psalms, thought about God as a shepherd who deals with his animals in a way that is very careful, that takes care about the needs that are there, and not only about, well, I would like to produce as much as possible. So this is, I think, a very inspiring way of looking to the Bible, the Christian tradition, not to say, here it said, thou shalt not this, but that you can learn about how we speak about God, about duties that follow from, that can inspire, or at least can be critical to ways we deal with animal production. So in general, could tradition, the Christian tradition, be helpful? Well, to a certain extent, you can say it reflects a certain plurality we see in the overall society. So there's not one single type of Christian view, but at the same time, it provides sufficient ground to show respect for animals as part of the creation, and also to care for them for their own sake. And no, there are no simple answers. I would say in general, it's too complicated. But I think the Christian tradition, the Bible, can definitely inspire us to provide guidance in this type of complex debates. That was it. Thank you very much.